So yesterday I presented work characterizing the presentation of MS in the Latinx population, and this was in comparison to white Americans, and specifically we focused on age of onset and disease course at presentation. And so there has been some historical work that's looked at these patterns, but one of the key things is that we haven't quite accounted for disease duration in these prior studies, which have been done in locations across the United States. The reason this matters is that we know the Latinx communities has very different subpopulations in the geographic locations across the United States. So for example, in the LA region, majority of those who identify as Latinx are Mexican Americans. In New York and Providence, Rhode Island, majority are Puerto Ricans or Dominican Americans. And in Florida, in South Florida, you have a high proportion of Cuban Americans. And then in Orlando, you have a high proportion of Puerto Ricans. So again, the Hispanics are not a monolith in this country. It's a very diverse group. And so you really need to think about regional heterogeneity and how do we factor this in to our study design. And so that was one of the key questions of, one, we need to account for disease duration because with time, things that we've noticed is that self-identification, which is the ideal way of measuring race and ethnicity, may vary with time, especially when you think about the recent social justice movements of the last 8 years. There's an embracement and empowerment around how we identify as individuals. And maybe there's also a celebration about our identities as well. And so there could be a shift from older studies to more recent studies about how individuals identify, and that captures nuances in cultural variation. And so that was a lot of the motivation that inspired this work about, okay, is MS different in presentation between Latinx and white Americans? And we need to account for some of this variation that may play a role. And so we wanted to think of a study that can really capture all of this heterogeneity and at least start to answer some of these fundamental foundational questions. Findings were very surprising. So one thing we did is that we restricted our population to individuals diagnosed started in 2010. So we had data from 3,300 patients across 7 MS centers, and 7% were Latinx. That was about 250 individuals. And we adjusted for all of these relevant covariates. We also accounted for study location. And we saw that individuals who are Latinx were on average 4.5 years younger at first symptom of MS, which is a surprise, right? That's a huge difference. Then when we now stratified by presenting subtype, we can see when amongst those presenting with relapsing disease, they were on average 4 years younger. And then those with progressive disease, they were on average 6 to 7 years younger. And so when we looked back at the data to see what was the actual age, you can see with those presenting with relapsing disease, the Latinx patients were an average age 30 compared to 35 for the white Americans. The Latinx with progressive disease were an average age 33 compared to 41 for the white Americans. So potentially there's this, I would like to think about how to really make sure these are real findings, because this is potentially a paradigm shift in how we think about onset of this disease in diverse populations. One of the things I've done is I've done additional analyses which I have not presented here, where I've restricted to individuals born by certain decades. So even if I restrict to individuals born starting in 1990, the Latinx population were on average a year younger at MS onset. So, you know, people born in 1990 are very young, right? They're in their anywhere from 18 to 30, right? We're looking at a young population. So even restricting to that population, there is this difference there. So it's really this awareness about how MS is likely presenting itself earlier in the Latinx community.